Hi everybody, bjthebrave here, and I am finally recording my February balance patch thoughts and review. This patch has now been out for a couple of weeks now, maybe a week and a half, so we've had a little bit of time to actually play with this and kind of get a feel for it. And I normally do this like straight out the gates, but this time I kind of gave myself a little bit of time to reflect, and I feel like I'm ready to talk about it. So let's jump on in. So, as it says, we would like every warlord to have a chance on the ladder, and so obviously these balance patches is them working on ways to kind of try and promote as much deck diversity as possible, which sort of makes sense, and I think, you know, from their point of view, developers' point of view, makes sense, but it's also really great for us as gamers because we all know how boring it is when simply one warlord dominates. So yeah, really good. Let's have a look at the patch changes. So the first off, we've got the GothORS. Now the GothORS have probably been hit the hardest, and I imagine that some of these changes are somewhat of a delayed reaction. I think some of these were probably quite overdue, actually, if I'm honest. So let's take a little look at them. So the first one is the Boondacker Snazwagon. Now, I've used the Snazwagon a lot, and in the previous season, this was one of the kind of core cards in my main meta deck, which I believe was tier 1. It was in the deck that me and Alski ran in the top 10, so I'm fully aware of how good this is, and particularly with the fact that we can use the level 20 Forge stratagem to basically get this discounted and play it on turn 3. It was very good. So what have they changed? Well, they've added unstable to it. Makes sense in that it is a vehicle and it didn't have unstable before, so they've added unstable to it, and they've lowered the melee attack from 4 to 3. Now, I don't mind the melee attack change too much. One of the things about the Snazwagon is it had pretty equal stats, so it could always choose to attack with melee and range. This is kind of making it a little bit more of an anti-flyer unit, but of course it can still benefit from things like Makari to get that buff. So I don't think that hurts it too much. The slightly bigger deal is the unstable. I think the unstable does matter a little bit more, particularly with when you're using Gruck, for example. One of the things about Gruck is that it's quite vulnerable, and losing life to unstable can actually matter. It can actually make a difference. It can obviously also kill your Makari if it's next to it, or take out any sort of other unit. So unstable's a big deal, and I still don't like unstable. I still would like to see unstable reduced a little bit, perhaps only doing up to 2 damage max instead of 3. But overall, I still think this card is very usable, very playable. It's still very powerful. It's still flank, and I think this is a pretty harsh change. It's a pretty harsh change, but it depends whether how long unstable stays as it is. But currently, I think it's quite hard. I'm not sure it needs to go that far, but I can see why they've nerfed this card. You know, they've got so many flanking units, and so I can kind of see why they've targeted this, and I think that it's still usable. Now, Spanner, they've lowered the efficiency of the bonus. When they buffed Spanner a few months ago, it kind of felt like they'd gone over the top, and yet, funnily enough, the Orcs have so many good cards that you often don't see the Spanner synergy being overly abused, even though it's there and it's very good. So they've lowered the efficiency. I don't actually know what that means. I don't actually know specifically how they've lowered it, and I think when we do these kind of nerfs and buffs, it'd be good to kind of understand more specifically what exactly has changed and how. But I can kind of go along with this. I do think the Spanner had been buffed to a point where it kind of was just a bit crazy. Like, you know, if your opponent got it off, or if you got it off, it was just this kind of like, not necessarily game over, but it was game winning at times. It was very powerful, probably a bit too much, so that makes sense. Next up, we've got the Squig Buggy, and again, they've lowered the melee attack from 4 to 3. I quite like this. It's a very powerful unit, and the 6 drop. and if you don't want to kind of change or undo the buff that it got, by just kind of lowering it, again it makes it more specifically a range damage dealer, so I think that's quite a good nerf actually. Now the next one's really important, which is proper killer. They lower the melee attack from 2 to 1. Guys, proper killer is still going to get used in Orc decks going forward. Trust me, this is not the end of this card. However, it perhaps is a much needed... I think this was the card... I came to the point of the conclusion of that this was the card that probably needed the nerf the most in Orcs, because it was the card that most efficiently led to the most amount of victories, I think, for the Orcs, and along with Makari in particular, the combo was just too much. It just gave the Orcs just a little bit too much range, and I'm quite looking forward to being able to play against Orcs now where their range isn't quite as silly, but it still does give them range, right? So you can still get 3 attack, and then if you've got Makari, that's 4, so you can still have 8 range attack with Makari and proper killie. So it certainly hasn't gone away, but it's just toned it down a little bit, and I really do think that was necessary, especially for a card where you can have 2 of, you know, it's not a legendary card. Next up we got the Green Horde. Now, the Green Horde has increased from 3 to 4, quite simply. As an Orc player, I'm like, oh, but I do think this makes sense. I think it was a little bit OP at 3 energy, and there are different ways they could have tackled the Green Horde, but in a short term and simple kind of tweak to the card, going from 3 to 4 actually is a big deal. It means that a lot of combos throughout the game, like things that were energy 7 combos, now are energy 8, so everything gets like slowed down slightly, so it just gives the opponent a little bit more of a chance against it. I don't think it kind of like negates the strategies, but it just slows it down by an extra turn, so I think that's a pretty sensible one. Next up we got Rock Invasion. Now the Rock Invasion says change the description from deploy 8 random Orc infantry that cost 4 or less. This is a huge change. Many of you will know already that often when you played Rock Invasion you were looking for things like Ardshell, which was a huge unit, a 7 cost legendary that you could get multiple of them, and it gave you Vanguard. Now there's no way to get that, and that means there's no way to get Vanguard now from Rock Invasion. So at first glance I think this card's got even riskier and worse. However, when it says it costs 4 or less, that does mean that the Orc Nob legendary, is in that range. Although I've never ever drawn Orc Nob in Rock Invasion, I'm pretty convinced that it was like one of those hidden things, and that it was always coded that it couldn't come out, even though it should technically. Now, please let me know in the comments if you've had a chance to play with this and you've got the Orc Nob. If you have, it completely changes the card, right? Because Orc Nob coming out will mean that other things can suddenly get flank, which is very, very powerful. Let's say that you can't get the Orc Nob, which you should, given that description, then I think what this becomes is just purely a proactive thing. It's still not bad. Like, on 10 energy, to flood the board with even just Orcs that cost 4 and 3 and 2, whatever, it's still going to be... 8 units are still going to be more value than just 10 energy, if that makes sense. So, but it would become a purely proactive card. Like, you couldn't... so it's almost not a win more, but definitely a closing out kind of card. So I could definitely see me dropping Rock Invasion, to be honest, but there's some things about this again that I've obviously raised. There's questions there. I'd want to understand like how they work, specifically if the Orc Nob is included. So overall, I think the Orcs have got some... They've been hit pretty hard, and people are going to have to rethink their approach with the Orcs now to what's been meta previously, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think Orcs are dead. They've still got some very, very powerful cards, and I still think, and what this might actually do is open up the other cards in the pool a little bit more. We might see some more variety in the Orcs. So overall, when I get back to Orcs, I've played a lot of Orcs last few seasons, so it's a good time to have a little break, but when I get back to them, I'm really excited to kind of like reinvent some decks and play them. So let's go on to the Necrons, the Sotek Dynasty. Next up we've got Nemesis Zandrake. Now the first thing they've done is essentially given this guy an extra card, and that's great because this guy needed something, right? He was terrible. compared to Imatech, compared to Oricon, and they're giving it the Uriel treatment, which is, I don't really like that, because I don't like the idea that we just give, well, I say I don't like, maybe I do, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the idea of giving different warlords from different factions like just the same generic ability. But maybe starting with an extra card is like a good generic ability that the sort of 35 health, some of the 35 health underplayed cards could benefit from. So I haven't tried this yet. I do have an MSR Zandrek deck. If you've not checked out my kind of Ghost Arcs deck, it's really fun. I really enjoy playing that deck, and I'd really like to see how the extra card kind of like impacts that, whether it does or doesn't. So yeah, cool, nice to see. I don't know if it'll be enough, to be honest. Uriel could benefit from that a lot by putting out a very good aggro deck, which I don't believe Zandrek can. So I am not convinced that it will be as big a deal as when Uriel got this, but I'm kind of happy to see it either way. Okay, so next up we have got the Tombblade. Now the Tombblade has lowered its melee attack from 2 to 1. Makes sense when you look at the artwork of the card, but from just a pure gameplay perspective, I don't love this change, to be honest. It's lost some flexibility there. Not too bad on the defense because it's still a flyer, so your opponent generally has to attack its ranged attack anyway, which is 3. But you know, not having really the ability now to use its melee attack, I think it's weakened the card somewhat. It is a very useful remnant though, the Tombblade, so it perhaps is more powerful than its stats suggest because of that. So, you know, obviously the Everguild have seen the data and decided it needs to be nerfed, so I can see where they come from with it, to be honest. I think we just need to play it and see. The Lich Guard, however, had its health lowered from 6 to 5, and I'm torn on this one because again I can kind of see why you've done it. Look, let's be honest, the Lich Guard's been one of the most powerful units, infantry units in the Cytec dynasty forever. So, but the thing is like, is that okay? Like, do we want it to be? And you think about its style of play, the kind of resilient deck, like Lich Guard really plays into that, and it feels like with this and the last nerf where they chipped away its melee attack, I'm not sure it's actually any good anymore. I'm not sure if it's like really, I mean, it's certainly not nerfed into being like bad, but it might be distinctly average now as a 5-drop. So I'm not loving the Lich Guard nerf, if I'm honest. They've taken one of the strong cards and severely weakened it. The next one is the Hexmat Destroyer, and they've changed it to basically dealing 1 damage to 4 random enemies. I really hate this change. I'm not gonna lie. Why do I hate this change? First of all, I don't think this card needed to change. I think it opened up some really good synergies to be able to do a Necron control build that was late game. The game doesn't really have many options to design decks in that way, and this was one of them, and they've nerfed it, and I'm just like, that's not what we need to be targeting right now in this game. We need to be opening up options for control builds. I really don't like it. The second thing I don't like about it is that the 4 enemies are random, and you know, whenever the kind of thing is random, then again, especially as a control player, I'm not actually in control of what I'm attacking, and I just think this is a really bad change. This might be, in my opinion, the worst change in the whole patch. So I really don't like this change. I'd really love to see this undone at some point. Don't get me wrong, Destroy was very powerful, so maybe, you know, when you combine it with, say, the Curse, which obviously gives everything vulnerable 3, it does mean now that it's not an automatic board wipe, and in that particular combo I can kind of see how it's like, okay, yeah. But personally, I don't think this was necessary. Next up, we got the Spider Nest. Change the description, deploy 2 Scarabs. Yeah, I like that. The Nest was the key engine in the kind of horribly annoying Scarab builds, which were not popular with people in the game, and I think making it harder to kind of get that off is a good thing. So I've no qualms with it becoming 2 scarabs instead of 3. And next up we have the Tomb World, which has increased the cost from 8 to 9. Now, if you listen to like the podcast, the Forgecast podcast that the Ecclesiarch and I do, we've talked about this at nauseam, and quite frankly, this is a good change. Making it cost 9 instead of 8 makes a lot of sense. It's incredibly broken when you play a Tomb World on energy 8 turn, which is what, turn 7, and you've already got the units in the graveyard. I think that the power of Tomb World is high, and making it cost more makes complete sense. It's still massively worth it. This ain't going anywhere, and most of the time the Necron player didn't play it on turn energy 8 turn anyway. They played it later, so I actually don't think it's going to make that much of a difference, but either way I think it's a good thing that they've made it more expensive. Overall I think the Necrons have really been hurt in this patch. I think it's nice that Xandrek got a buff, but it's I don't think it's going to actually be kind of like game changing. But the other changes I actually think have really hurt some of the units and some of the key synergies, particularly the Lich Guard and the Destroyer. So I don't particularly think Imatech is coming out of this very well, and that's not because of like the Tomb World one, which people might jump to first. I think, as I say, is absolutely good, really good change, but the Lich Guard and the Hexmark have really hurt it, and I'm not sure Necrons have even got the tools anymore to really be a prominent top tier control deck. So I think South-Tech are in need of some new tools. So the Simharm next have only one change, and that is Striking Scorpion increasing its health from 2 to 3. A lot of people ran Scorpion because it was a kind of easy way of guaranteeing a stone on turn 3, because you can trade it with the enemy Warlord, and then you can actually, with only 2 health, will die, and then you can actually guarantee the stone. So in a way it's like a micro nerf in giving it the extra health. That said, there's many other times where you play your Scorpion, it has got stealth, and it could be taken out by AoE or something like pyrotechnics and stuff like that, blast units. So this really helps mainly against blast 2, I think, and probably overall is a really good thing, and Scorpion's a pretty good card now. Next up we've got the High Fleet Leviathan, and the first one that's changed here is the Ripper Swarm. I really love this change. This change basically increases Tide from 2 to 3. Now, Ripper Swarm was already a card that I originally very much ignored, and had really started to come round to and understand the value of the Ripper Swarm. Particularly its flexibility to help play Tyranids as a tempo deck. You can play it on first turn, you play it on second turn, and basically by adding the extra Tide, it just gives it even more reach and range and flexibility. And I think it suits it more anyway. I think the Rippers should be a bigger swarm, which it is. So yeah, I'm really happy with this change. I think it's great, and I think Ripper Swarm's a pretty good card right now. Next up we got Morlock. Increase the melee attack from 4 to 5 and the health from 5 to 6. I think the biggest deal here is the melee attack, because it already has the blast, but it did suffer a little bit on turn 5 from being able to take out the unit that your opponent played on turn 5, and I think the increased melee attack helps with that. The health from 5 to 6 just means that it doesn't die, it can actually get strike off, and then it can actually jump back into your deck. So overall, pretty good. I quite like the Morlock anyway. I always think it's a bit of an underrated card. I don't think it's a great card, but I think it's underrated. I do think it's a good tech card. Depending on where the meta goes, Morlock could definitely be a good tech card. And if we ever get a tournament scene around the game, I can see Morlock being used as a great tech card there too. So overall, it's a welcome buff. Now we got a couple of the bigger bugs, the big Tyranid units, and I will release a deck around big bugs shortly, but we have the Exocrine and the Tyrannofex. Now, what they've gone for here is just an increase to the stats. So melee attack from 2 to 4 for Exocrine, and the Tyrannofex has increased its health from 12 to 14 with the melee attack going up from 3 to 5. That's all good, guys. Nothing major here. I'd say, yep, welcome that. Like we've talked about before, particularly on the podcast, about how these bigger units, more expensive units, you know, they should be impactful, they should be good. The problem is that these changes don't really achieve that. I mean, honestly, you could make the Terran effects have 20 health. That's not the problem that the 10 energy Terran effects has. It still costs 10 energy and does nothing on the turn that it comes down. So for me, the problem is with these units are definitely not solved, but at least, you know, it does make them slightly more scary, you know, better in draft, for example, better for new players and beginners who might have these in the decks. But certainly at the kind of like meta end of the game, these changes aren't going to make any difference at all. The Norm Emissaries received a change, which is great. It's not the change I wanted to see. The change I wanted to see with Norm Emissary is that the for those who don't know, basically it started out costing 15 energy, and every time you triggered Synapse, it got cheaper by 2. So you would often play it for actually something like 7 energy, or sometimes even less. Now, great that they've reduced it to 14. I think that's good. It makes it a little bit more viable. The thing I really wanted to see happen though is its ability to reduce its cost happen wherever the non-emissary is in the deck. What it currently does, guys, is it only discounts if it's in your hand, and I just feel like that's not necessary. I think it should work wherever it is in the deck. But if it is going to only be in your hand, then, you know, reducing it to 14 is a good thing. Now then, one change I'm really excited about here is the infinite biomorphologies, which has now reduced from 3 to 2. I think this is fantastic, guys. I just released a deck guide just very recently, and it was my sort of Tyranid Engines deck, and I talked about how this card used to feel awkward anyway on turn 3 because it stopped you from playing your Gene Stealer or drawing or whatever. And so by the time we actually sat playing units, we kind of was quite far behind on tempo. Putting this to 2 energy instead of 3 is perfect. It just feels good now. Like it just feels right. I think this card was always meant to be 2 and not 3 energy. It is a legendary card, so you only have one of them, and it's harder to kind of more consistently have obviously in your opening hand anyway, so making it 2 is fantastic. I also think this card's got some you know, it's just more synergies, like synergy with the new Tyrant where you can get multiples of these off, or you know, a giant Gnome Queen. You can imagine like giving it Vanguard, for example, with this. It gives it a little bit more, it gives this card a little bit more late game viability. Overall, just very good change, and I think this is going to be staple now in Tyranids, as it should be. Next up, we've got the High Fleet Leviathan change. Description 2: your troops cost 1 less for the rest of this battle. Draw a troop. I still think this card's useless. I still think it is, I mean, obviously it's better that it now draws a card. It didn't draw a card before, but I still think it's just too expensive and comes down too late. So there we go, guys. Overall, I think it's a pretty good balance patch. They've addressed some of the very powerful units. I think kind of Tyranids have come out the worst, to be honest. Orcs have obviously been hit in terms of their meta decks, but I'm confident that Orcs can reshuffle and regain a very powerful place in the meta. It just won't be quite as obvious synergies and quite as easy to ascertain, which is a good thing for the game overall. So yeah, overall I'm pretty happy with the buffs and nerfs. That's my opinions on it. Let me know what you think, especially since you've been playing now for a couple of weeks. Let me know in the comments what's working well for you, what you're disappointed about in terms of these changes, and anything you'd like to see reverted. And please like and subscribe to the channel. Other than that, I'll see you in the next one.